As Rob says, I've had fingers in many pies involved in biodiversity management over time. I've also had involvement in an Indigenous nursery that's now, I think, just celebrated 25 years of operation, so that's really exciting. So for the next 20 minutes or so, I hope to take you along a journey that the Nillumbik Landcare Network has been following in pursuit of measures, or in its pursuit of measures for forest and woodland health. So to start with, I'm going to play you two 30-second sound files. They're both recorded at 5:30 in the morning during January this year at two different locations within Nillumbik. I want you to listen carefully, close your eyes even, because I'm going to want you to choose which one you think represents the healthier forest habitat. So you've heard them both. Quick show of hands. Who thinks Site 1 represents the healthier forest habitat? I did this at my work and I had about 50-50. So I'm assuming everybody thinks Site 2 represents the healthier habitat. Is that true? Yeah. Excellent. Why? Give me some of the reasons why you reckon that represents healthier habitat. Sorry? No miners, so no introduced birds, yep.
What about species?
More species?
No, different species.
Different species? Yeah. So, and basically, yeah, there's, first one, there was certainly a introduced species in there. There were more species detectable in that second one, and it's also the nature of the species. Hold those thoughts, because as a direct result of using the open standards that you've heard Kate talk about, the Nillumbik Landcare Network is on a journey trying to seek similar answers to similar questions. So let me explain. First of all, the Nillumbik Landcare Network. It's in Nillumbik. And Nillumbik is rich in biodiversity. This is where you are right now, and that's the Port Phillip and Western Port region. This is approximately where remnant native vegetation occurs in the region based on 2005 modelling. That's where Nillumbik is. So, as you can see, there's a fair bit of remnant native vegetation in Nillumbik. That's public land. So you can still see there's a lot of remnant native vegetation not on public land, it's on private land. And this are the landcare groups that make up the Nillumbik Landcare Network. So those, and there's 11 of them, those groups have a fair role to play in helping manage native vegetation in Nillumbik. So there's 11 groups. Some of them, they range in age from 20 years old or more to, I think, 1 year old, the most recent one. We're supported by a state-funded part-time facilitator, Colin Broughton, who's in the audience here today. And I guess importantly, the landholders in there and elsewhere, they're biodiversity managers too. But they've got a fairly limited range of skills, knowledge, understanding to do that. So landcare groups, their role is trying to engage those landholders, connect them to nature, which gives them a motivation to do biodiversity management. And that includes helping them learn what to do, building their skills, and helping them take action. Back in 2014, with a little nudge from myself and a glowing testimonial from Kate, who you've just heard from, Kate also happens to be on the Nillumbik Landcare Network board, we decided to use the open standards to do some conservation planning. So there's the cycle. We applied successfully to Helen McPherson Smith Trust to get some funding, which enabled us to engage Stuart Cowell from Conservation Management to lead us through the process. Stuart expertly led us through a series of 5 facilitated full-day workshops in late 2014 and early 2015. And there was a small group of us working in between those workshops, refining some of the information that came out, preparing it for the next workshop. Representatives from 8 of our landcare groups participated pretty much through the whole process. But we also had representatives from Nillumbik Shire, Trust for Nature, Parks Victoria, Melbourne Water, and the Port Phillip and Western Port CMA. They all participated and contributed their expertise. And we created the working draft Nillumbik Landcare Network strategic plan. And in my view, it will probably remain a working draft to emphasise its adaptable nature. Some people get a little frustrated. It's not finished. The important thing is you want to be able to emphasise you can keep going back to it and improving it and refining it. This process we went through, however, was a big investment of time for a volunteer-based organisation. Most could see the value, but some struggled with the time involved or the detail involved, and in some cases the imprecision. They're just some participant perspectives. The green are the positive bits, the red are the not so positive bits that people had to say. Don't need to read it all necessarily. But despite all those challenges, there have been many benefits for the network. It engaged, by engaging all these different group representatives to work together to find some common goals and measures and things of value. This was great for a young network, a relatively young network. It brought these groups together to actually work on something common to them. And it's, in my view, it's definitely strengthened the network. By including participation of volunteers and agency reps, it's broadened ownership of the results. So everybody feels like we're in this together. And that given us a shared sense of purpose. Importantly, it's made us focus on outcomes, on the things that we value. These are the things that we're trying to work towards improving, protecting. It's also made many of our assumptions much more explicit so that we're clear on what we're assuming, what we're expecting to happen as a result of doing things. It's given us a common language that we can use when talking with others, particularly those who've used the open standards. So everything you've heard Kate talk about, people are using the same language across the world. And Nillumbik Landcare Network can now talk that same language. It's also, in my view, made it easier to present a case for securing resources and or partners. So we went through the process. We came up with a number of conservation targets or assets or values. We've been calling them assets. We've got some potential measures and goals for many of those assets. This is what came out of the workshops. We identified threats, we've given them some ranking, and we've come up with some potential measures and objectives for those threats. We've identified a number of strategies, prioritised those, and we've created some results chains for the high priority strategies to address a number of the key threats. So the assets that we identified, 2 main types of remnant vegetation, dry forest woodlands, wet and damp forests, waterways and wetlands, rare and threatened orchids, small ground-dwelling fauna, cleared rural land. Importantly, several of our land care groups are farm-based, so the rural land, the cleared rural land, is still an important asset to them as well, and the open standards helps you deal with that as well. We've got a unique invertebrate in Eltham, and this one stood out by itself. But there was also the people in the landscape, their connection to environment, their knowledge, their skills. There's a lot of knowledge and skills of people in Nillumbik. All of these, within those, there are many nested assets or nested values. But these groupings are largely based on their similar management needs. We also identified a number of threats and assessed their ranking against each of those assets. And this is sort of the overall ranking across all the assets that we arrived at for each. It's important to note that this doesn't dictate what you do, this informs what you do. So you make your decisions with this knowledge. For the Nillumbik Landcare Network, a volunteer-based organisation, we wanted to practice going further through the cycle of the open standards. To do that, we wanted to choose one results chain, which was linked to a strategy, which linked a strategy to assets and a threat. The results chain we chose was the one that addressed a strategy that addressed the threat of woody weeds on the two different forest assets: dry forest and woodlands, wet and damp forests. And don't be scared by the next slide. We did come up with a results chain in the workshops. Because we chose to focus in on this results chain, we've actually refined it and reviewed it and updated it. It looks like that. Please don't try reading it. So already we're adapting. So what we came up with in the workshop, we've gone back to, look more closely and refined and improved it. So the strategy was basically coordinate a program to engage private landholders in managing woody weeds in remnant vegetation with support from existing. So that was the broad strategy. And all in between, these yellow boxes, they're some of the actions. These are the intermediary results that we hope to achieve, and ultimately get to the end of the results chain. And this is the importance of the results chain. It got us focusing at this end of the chain, which is, what are we trying to achieve with our assets? What are we trying to achieve with reducing that threat of woody weeds? We came up with this as an objective. Importantly, the open standards emphasises measuring the impact of a threat, not the extent of a threat. So we felt that if we had a woody weed cover threshold, below which we felt was the impact of woody weeds was negligible or minimal or tolerable, then that becomes our indicator, our measure. So we came up with a threshold of, if we can get it down to less than 1%, it's not getting rid of all woody weeds, but if it's less than 1%, it's not having the impact that we think it would necessarily, or its impact is minimal. So that's also, we had to come up with a SMART objective. So I had a SMART, measurable, etc., etc. Then we realised we had to define what our forest assets were. So we've got this, but what do they look like spatially? The council at the time was undergoing a review of its environmental significance overlay, which included mapping of habitat, and that was split into core and buffer habitat. And that we felt was the best available mapping of forest and woodland extent within the Shire. We then clipped that to the modelled EVCs, and we then allocated the different EVCs into one of the two assets. So whether it was wet and dry forest and woodland, wet and damp forests or dry forest and woodlands. And that's what we've come up with. So the yellow is one of the assets, and the dark green is the other. However, to be able to measure these where the woody weed cover was below 1%, we need to decide on what are we going to apply the 1% to. So our current thinking is to treat the area of each forest asset on an individual property as a separate parcel, and then determine which parcels have woody weed cover above or below the 1%. I'll illustrate this on a map for a subset of this area, but first of all I just need to fade the background. We're going to look at Christmas Hills Landcare Group area, so we'll just zoom in a bit. And the reason we're doing this is because this is the bit of data I've had access to. So we've had a crack at, this is just a desktop exercise, just working with a few people who, off the top of the head, could say, yep, those properties have got below 1%, those ones are above, those ones we don't know. And that's what you're looking at. Green are forest assets by property parcel where woody weed cover is below 1%. Red is where we know it's above 1%. The cross-hatching, we don't know at the moment. But that in itself is enabling us to more easily see where the threat of woody weeds is, where it might need to be addressed, or where we need to find out. So for example, that property there, we know work is happening at the moment. It's still above 1%, but that work is actually happening to reduce woody weeds on that property. Similarly with that one, and these two here are the subject of a funding application that we're putting in right now to get woody weeds below. So those ones are helping us work out where should we work. The rest ones are probably working where should we engage. Okay? We need to get those people on board, find out whether or not we need to help them control woody weeds. So it's helping our decision making. So back to the assets. We also had to re-examine the asset condition measures that we'd originally come up with for our two forest types. So we had an extent measure, which was fairly straightforward, but the condition was the health or the condition of the forest. So this is what we came up with in the workshops. Thinking was around indicator species of a sort. So that's where we started to head down. We were conscious of staying focused on finding indicators or measures that can actually reflect the effect of management on the condition of our forest assets, rather than how much biodiversity we have. So it was very much trying to find indicators. And I don't know if Stuart will mention, but he's got a great example of a rock band using indicators extremely well. M&Ms as an indicator. Ask him once. So we started heading down this path. Can we come up with a suite of indicator species for these assets? So this is Michael Scroggy. He's a scientist based here at ARI. He is experienced in designing monitoring programs. So we initially went to him and said, look, can you help us get together a group of people that might be able to help us decide what's a suitable suite of indicator species for these two forest assets? So that's what we originally approached him about. But then he came back and said, don't worry about that yet. Set up a simple monitoring program, work out what is there, and then from there you might start looking for your indicator species. So we said, all right, Michael, help us design a suitable program. But it's got to be a program that is practical and affordable for a volunteer-based organisation that we can actually do. So some compromises were agreed to. So this is what we've nominally come up with. We have a stratified random sampling approach. So statisticians among you will know that. No worries. Others will go, what the hell's that? Basically, you divide it up into a few different sectors and then random points are selected within those sectors. We've concluded that we can try and get 30 sampling sites, 20 in the dry forest and woodland asset, which is much more extensive, and 10 in the wet and damp forest. At each of these locations, we just need to do a bit of a baseline assessment, do a habitat assessment at each of those points, take photographs, etc. But importantly, we want to set up one motion sensing camera, one sound recorder at each of those sites for 14 days, and then do 6 sites at a time over the spring period, because we don't have 30 cameras and we don't have 30 sound recorders. Currently we've got funding for 5 of each. We're going to try and get 1 more pair. But also, to make all this happen, we're going to need someone's time. We need someone's time to negotiate agreements for all those monitoring locations, whether it's public or private, as well as get the equipment out, bring it back, store the data, run the analysis. So that's where the points have landed on the map. We also recognise that some of those might be impossible to achieve, so we've got backup, or sort of next best option for each point. And some of those are on public land. So we're currently in that process of trying to negotiate those agreements. And we're working with the individual landcare groups. What do they know about each of those, any of those landholders? While all this was going on, I happened to, by chance, catch this episode of Catalyst, which introduced the whole concept, to me at least, of soundscapes and acoustic indices that can be generated from sound recordings. Also along the way we met Dr. Karen Roe, who is a scientist at Museums Victoria, and we connected to her through the VNPA's Communities Listening for Nature program. She's working on a project that's building a sound library of bird calls and automated call recognisers, and has been providing us with very valuable advice, including that there are some acoustic indices that can be generated from sound files using the open source statistical software R, which I'd never heard of before this. But which index to use? This is a new and emerging young field. So a bit of online research trying to work out which of all these different indices might serve our purposes. Because it's new and emerging, nothing's really stood out ideally, but the normalised difference soundscape index is the one that looks most suitable at this point in time. And it's largely based on calculating a ratio between biophony, human-made sounds, and biophony, animal vocalisations, and anthrophony, human-based sounds. All right, so we decided to have a practice run at collecting some data and seeing if we could calculate this. So went back to VNPA, we borrowed one of these. It's a SM4 song meter sound recorder to do some test recordings. We picked 2 sites that we knew were easy to access. They're basically home properties of a couple of the people that were working on this. So you remember those 2 sound files I played at the start? This is what they look like as a spectrogram. The frequency of sound on the vertical axis, time on the horizontal, and the different colours represent decibel levels. So this one came up with so that was the first one. The NDSI score was minus 0.2. So the NDSI, because of that ratio, can be anywhere from -1 to +1. At least 3 different species were detected, possibly a couple more. And different species have different acoustic signatures. So it's now possible, so therefore it's possible to create recognisers to pick those out. To illustrate that, those are the signatures of a red wattlebird. That's the spotted turtle dove. This is what site 2 looks like as a spectrogram. We got a bird expert who picked out at least 5 different species in there. This came up with a score of 0.9 on the NDSI. And significantly there were important woodland birds in there, so the type of species also was important. So that's the yellow robin, there's the grey fantail. So what do those sites actually look like? Sorry, there was others, and of course there was a cow. Did you pick that when you were listening? So this is what Site 1 looks like. It's in Hurstbridge. This is Site 2 in Christmas Hills. And if you step back on a landscape scale, that's what Site 1 looks like. Still got a fair bit of forest there, but relatively urbanised. There's Site 2. So we've certainly found that this normalised difference soundscape index still has some shortcomings, although we think we might be able to overcome some of these. We did our recordings in summer. Cicadas call constantly at the top end of the frequency, so they were resulting in, we had cicadas calling, we were getting very high scores consistently. Some native animals call below the frequency threshold that they're using to differentiate between anthrophony and biophony. So owls call, so something like an owl call might get counted as human-made sound. And then things like wind and rain also add some complications. So our conclusion is, yep, we think the NDSI is useful, but we need some other things to complement it. So we've made a few basic assumptions. We reckon the healthier our forests and woodlands are, there's more species using them. So we'll be looking at just a simple species richness. How many different species are we actually picking up on the cameras and the sound recorders? And then certain species will be more likely to be used them if they're healthy, and that's where we start to look for indicator species. Again, what we can pick up on the cameras and the recorders. Hopefully we can get some call recognisers for those species that we're of particular interest. We've also recently discovered or come across the Wildlife Picture Index. No, that photo wasn't taken locally in Nillumbik. But the Wildlife Picture Index uses camera trap data to generate an index, and to date it's been used as a way at looking at the effects of climate change and land use change on tropical terrestrial mammal and bird diversity. We're still to determine whether it's going to help us in our situation or not, but we have recently made contact with the author. So at this juncture, it's just important to remember that we're not trying to measure in any absolute terms how much biodiversity we have. Rather, what signs can indicate to us with a level of confidence that overall changes in forest health might be occurring as a result of our collective efforts to protect and improve the condition of our forests and woodland assets. So are we having the desired effect? We're looking for indicators of landscape scale management effect. So we want to trial our proposed monitoring program later this year, and we've just applied for funds through the Norman Wetenhall Foundation. That is pretty much just some person's time to do all the legwork. We'll also seek other funds to get some analysis software and some additional recorders. So in summary, the open standards has set us, the Nillumbik Landcare Network, on a journey towards trying to find a practical, cost-effective, Nillumbik-wide method and measures of forest and woodland health so that we can get a sense of whether the efforts of ourselves, our agency partners in Melbourne Water and Parks Victoria and the Council are actually having the desired effect. And that journey continues still. Thank you.